right now. I see some faces that I don't recognise. My name is Mike Townsley. I am the Head of School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and also your first speaker today. I'm absolutely flattered that so many people are here. It is, for those of you not in the university, a really busy time. Everyone's marking, or maybe this is the draw, is you're not marking. I'm not sure. But it's really nice to see so many people. Thank you. So what we're going to present is some preliminary research on something Dan, Tim and I have been working on, looking at mobility patterns of young people and trying to look at how that correlates with victimisation. So I'm going to kick off. Dan is going to talk later about the project and the recruitment, and Tim is going to finish on the results. So just to say, okay, so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk really briefly about a bit of theory and some of the problems around theory and the solution that we think we've found. And then Dan's going to talk about the pilot project that demonstrates whether we've done that and some of the results, some of the key results Tim's going to address. I should say at the outset that this pilot project was funded by GCI as part of their strategic projects. So I'd like to thank the Institute for doing that. We couldn't have done that without their support. Okay, so this is really quick. Environmental criminology is the branch of criminology that places opportunity at the focus of their attention. So if there are lots of easy opportunities to commit crime, we expect there to be more crime. And so from a crime prevention point of view, we try to make the quality of those opportunities to be less, to be like really difficult opportunities, or restrict the volume of opportunities. If we can do that, there should be less crime. There's three main theories, but I'll just quickly talk about routine activity theory. Is all about the rate at which motivated offenders come into contact with suitable targets. If you're able to control the rate at which they come into contact, you should be able to shift the volume of crime. If we look spatially, crime pattern theory is basically routine activity theory, but it's looking at the spatial patterns of crime. So we're interested in the distribution of land use, mobility patterns, where offenders come from and where victims or targets are located. And if we understand that, we can start to think about crime patterns, or we can infer the background processes of crime patterns. So here is for crime pattern theory, this is the sort of stereotypical or abstract version of what we call activity space. So it's straightforward. We all have nodes. Nodes are places that we spend a lot of time at, and we're very familiar with those places. So work, home, wherever we shop. There are paths. Paths are the ways we get between nodes. So the way you came from your home to work is probably the way that you always come, or you've got a very small number of distinct ways of getting of commuting. If you combine paths and nodes, we call that an activity space, and this is really your cognitive mental map of Brisbane or your home. And the last major concept is awareness space, and awareness space is a subset of your activity space constrained by time. So right now, if I was motivated to commit crime or to exploit criminal opportunity, I'm really constrained to this room. I cannot exploit opportunities right now at home or where I shop. Okay. Now, so what we're really interested in is the activity space. If we knew about everyone's activity space, we could predict crime really, really well. The idea is that if you're an offender and you need to or are compelled to commit crime, where will you most likely encounter opportunities in your activity space? So it's really, what we're interested in is quantifying activity space. The dirty secret of environmental criminology is that we've not been very good at actually quantifying activity spaces really well. What we do is we ask people, what is your activity space? So we might say, how many times do you spend away from home on an average week? That's problematic because what's an average week? Some weeks can be very different. And also, we don't often, in victimisation surveys, ask detailed information about what you're actually doing on those nights out. So even if so a typical question in a victimisation survey is, how many nights do you spend in bars on an average week? The problem is that not all bars are created equal. So risky facilities tells us that 20% of all places account for 80% of crime. So there are a small handful of bars that are really bad, and if you spend one night in there, you expose yourself to an awful lot of crime risk. There are some places that you could go there every night of the week and you're exposing yourself to not much risk at all. So, in terms of trying to measure people's exposure to risk, it's really important that we understand specifically where they are and what they're doing. And the last thing to say is, so we ask people, what is your activity space, or even with some offenders, some studies look at drawing maps. Draw a typical day in your life, where do you go, where do you spend time? That's all subject to recall bias. You know, we're relying on humans to be perfect, recall perfectly their experiences or their knowledge, which is often problematic. The other thing is in surveys telescoping. So you might bring forward events or push events back, depending, because our thinking back in time is often imperfect. So those are the major problems. What we think is smartphones might be a way of getting us a little bit further in developing our insight. Now, smartphones have an array of sensors that are really quite accurate, but are constantly passively recording information about where and when you are. So if anyone's into running, I'm sure you've got like a running app on your phone. You can track all your runs, and they provide so much information about altitude, steps taken. It's really, really impressive. Or Strava is what some of the cyclists use. And that just gives you an indication. If you've not seen it, we'll show you some Strava-like maps in a second. That gives you an indication of the sort of things that you can capture and would give you way more accurate information about the nodes and paths and activity spaces that ordinary people have. What smartphones aren't necessarily great at, in terms of the way we've implemented it, is gathering information about peers. Who are you with? What exactly are you doing? What's the context in which you're doing those activities? So what's the guardianship potential? So for instance, our work has been somewhat inspired by Pierre Wickstrom, who introduced a type of instrument called a space-time budget. And what that does is it breaks down days by hours, and then a researcher will sit down with a participant and say, at 8 a.m. where were you? And then record who they were with, what they were doing and where they were, and go hour by hour through the day. Now what they do, that's so time intensive, for all of their participants, they record 4 days a year. So they'll pick a week and they'll say, tell us about 2 days last week and tell us about the most recent weekend, and they capture that. And what you'll see is we are able to capture, with smartphones, way more information. The other thing that's great about smartphones is you have the potential of something called ecological momentary assessment. This is pushing surveys to people in the moment. Rather than asking you, in the last 12 months, have you been victim of crime? We can ask you, in the last week, have you been victim of crime? Or we can ask you, right now, are you with your peers, or etc., etc. So there is the potential for much more timely and accurate information. So, are you taking over, or? Okay, so I will throw to Dan now, because Dan knows much more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So, following on from what Michael said, obviously we think that smartphones might be this really smart way, it's in the name, to try and capture some of this more nuanced information about people's nodes and activity spaces and where and when they spend time. So, taking this money from the GCI Pilot Project Fund, we decided to kind of work out whether this was actually a possible thing to do. We're not going to try and secretively track people. We're going to have to ask them, can we track you, and try and convince them that this is a good idea, and come up with some sort of remuneration structure and see what data we get back from that. So it says there we decided to run a pilot study to see if we could convince strangers to let us track their movement for an extended period of time. So we can't put GPS trackers on people's shoes or whatever when they're not looking. So the plan was that we were going to advertise to people through social media and say, hey, can we track your movements for 2 months using a smartphone app? And the be all and end all is that it turns out that some young people actually did let us do this. I have no idea why no one's ever going to sign up for this, but it turns out that you can do this. So what we did, given that we were predominantly thinking about young people, so 18 to 24-year-olds is our time range, we thought, well, young people, they're all over social media. This is a great way to get our study out there, to find potential respondents. So we used the kind of Facebook targeted ad campaigns, the marketing materials through Facebook, to try and target 18 to 24-year-olds who are living in Brisbane and own a smartphone. So we set up a Facebook ad, and we can play around with variables just like kind of these nefarious marketers do to try and work out who to put it in front of and who not to put it in front of. But very broadly speaking, we were just looking for those categories. So we want 18 to 24-year-olds who are living in Brisbane and who have got a smartphone. So people are shown the ad for the study in their activity feed or whatever it is that they do on Facebook. I think it was on Instagram as well, I believe, which is something I really don't understand. And in essence, we directed them to just click to a project landing page where they would get more information about the study. There we talked about what the aim of the work was, what the remuneration structure would be, and we kind of played around with remuneration values to see whether the uptake rate was more or less, if we were going to pay for longer or we were going to track for longer, and so forth. And we also had them fill in a kind of eligibility survey. So this validates the Facebook tools in terms of targeting a population. So the first thing we do is go, hey, are you 18 to 24? If you click no, then you're thrown out of the survey in essence. Or do you own a smartphone? And do you live in Brisbane? If they say yes to all of those things, then they move on to the next stage of this eligibility survey, and we recorded a bunch of kind of demographic information, employment status, education, who you live with, those sorts of things, just to kind of intake survey so that we'd have some more variables to correlate all of our stuff against subsequently. And then finally, we asked them a question about whether they'd experienced victimisation within the last 2 months, just to give us some sort of idea of what the victimisation rate might be amongst the sample of people if we were then to track them for 2 months into the future. All of those people who met all of those criteria and said that they were happy, read all the ethics statements, they were then emailed a login token and links to a smartphone app for iOS or smartphone that they could, or iOS or Android that they could download, and all of these instructions for how to launch the app. So for the kind of pilot project, our target is to get 100 young people, and we want to track them for 1 month, but we tell them we're going to track them for 2 months, just to see whether they would be tracked for 2 months. We didn't have enough money to track them for 2 months, because we have to pay a company to process that data, but the logic here being, if they're prepared to be tracked for 2, then we can quite happily track them for 1 and then not worry about the rest of the data. Running a Facebook campaign, it's really, we had a great time, right? We felt like horrible marketing people going, oh, we've wormed our way into 40,000 Facebook users' feeds in the last, you can see all these amazing statistics about how many people have seen your advert, how many people have clicked on your advert. Then we can then look at the other end, how many people have pushed through the survey, how many people turn out to be 75 and or reporting this. We can look at all these statistics. Ultimately, over a kind of 96-hour period, which is really 4 24-hour periods over about a week, we showed the advert to about 40,000 Facebook users, and of those 40,000 Facebook users, 500 of them clicked through to the project landing page, which I don't even know whether that's a good click-through, like a good return rate if you're a terrible marketer. Of those 500 people, 95 people were eligible and enrolled in the study. And now we're going to use this smartphone app, so when they enroll, that means that they've gone through all of the processes, they've used their login tokens, they've installed the app, it's on their phone running, we can now start to record information from them. We're going to record their spatio-temporal behaviour, and we're going to talk about trips, which is basically people moving around their activity spaces. Of those 95 people, 61 of them had at least one trip. So we have 34 individuals who installed the app and either maybe then uninstalled it because they weren't happy about it, or maybe they, when it said this app is using your location, clicked no, so that we didn't get any data from them. But ultimately, 61 had at least one trip, but 48, the important number, were tracked for the entire month. Right, so now we get second by second spatio-temporal information about 48 people for 30 days. So the app that we're using is an app created by a Dutch company called DAP.mobility. They do a bunch of work in kind of travel demand modelling and thinking about where public services need to be. The app is called sense.dat, and this is the thing that's installed on your phone. And what this basically does is just passively record participant information or their spatio-temporal behaviour over time. And I'll talk a little bit now about what data the app generates so that we can think about analysing that data. So very broadly speaking, it generates this thing called trip data. The interesting thing, so we have to think about people's mobile phone batteries, right? You don't want the GPS running all the time. Your phone will run out of batteries after 7 or 8 hours. Everybody knows that if they've not, closed Google Maps, and sometimes it's run away and you've run out of batteries or you're not charging your phone. So it does a clever thing where if the phone sits still from the GPS for a certain amount of time, it'll turn the GPS off, and then it's only when you pick the phone up and the gyroscopes move, GPS will be turned on again and it'll check their location. When the gyroscopes enable the GPS, it then continuously records, in essence, an X and a Y, like a location and a time, every second. So we create these triads of information. So here's X and Y1 at T1, that's at second 1, at second 2, and so forth. And then all of this raw data, which is obviously millions and millions of rows of data, is then processed into trip and node information. So trip is about when you're going somewhere, and nodes are the places that you stay for any period of time. So some examples about how we can kind of infer things from this information. So this is not you, Michael, by the way. It does look quite a lot like you, it's also an open source image, so maybe it's you. Maybe you can put pictures of yourself on the internet. So here's Michael, sat, using his MacBook, and here's the location at Griffith, so obviously the coordinates are completely fictitious. He's sat there, he doesn't go anywhere at second 2. Now the GPS turns off because it says, hey, this guy's not moving. There's some amount of time later, he's still at that location. Okay, so we're pretty confident that you're there. We're going to start to infer that that's a node of some kind. If Michael gets up, see I match the shoes. It took 8 minutes, but it took longer than the product, matching the shoes. So in this scenario, you can see that the x coordinate just moves slightly, so you're going that way. I mean, it's a pretty rudimentary coordinate system, but still, and it's taken you 4 seconds to run across campus, so you've been working out quite well. But in essence, this is the data that we're generating, the raw data, where people are at a particular point in time. It goes a little bit further than that, so we can use kind of slightly more intelligent algorithms and ancillary data from geospatial information to try and infer things like mode of transport. So my example here, we're recording every 3 seconds, we work out the change in X in essence, and we can infer some sort of speed of travel. We know that it's on a road because we've got the spatial information, so we go, hey, that person's on a bike, maybe they're on a fast horse. To be fair, that's a crime risk factor we may have missed here. Similarly, if we move a bigger distance in the same amount of time, we can infer a faster speed of travel. Again, we know it's on a road, so now we think a person's in a car. Finally, here we've got a person who is at one location, goes to another location, stays at that location, and then moves to another location, but still at quite a speed. So we're like, well, what's happening here? We go, well, we know it's on a road, but also we know about all the bus stops on that road. So if we can see that people move in space and they travel at kind of normal vehicle speed, but they stop at regimented locations that can then be matched to bus stops, we can see, we think this person's on a bus. Okay, so that's really how we try and get more detailed information about the trips people make and the method of transport that they take in doing those trips. And the other thing that we can do is try and characterize what the locations are, so what the nodes are. So obviously, we don't, from the raw data, we might just say, well, this person stays at this location a lot, and stays at this location a lot, and stays at this location a little bit less, which doesn't tell us all the information we really want to know. So we can start to use stuff about visit frequency, the duration of those visits, the day of the week, the time of the day, and then this ancillary GIS data to try and make more sense of what people are doing. So again, here's the location. You visited that place 26 times out of 30 days. It's a pretty good score for me. I was in all week, but went home at the weekend, and it's a lie now, I never got in at 7. But we start to generate these profiles associated with nodes, and then these algorithms can try and infer, like, is this your home location, which would obviously have the inverse relationship to here, and here we say, oh, we think that this is your place of work. So do I now, do you start here? Yes. All right, well, Tim will now tell us how we use all of that information to find out something magical.
The first thing we did is we took a look at the data that was sent back to us from data mobility, and it turned out we had over 1 million of these triad points. And this is actually a real screen capture of a part of Brisbane where our 48 participants traveled during the 30-day data collection period. So we had to decide, well, how are we going to analyze this? What approach are we going to use? What is our unit of analysis going to be? So we decided on using trips as a unit of analysis. So you had this originating node and then some sort of travel through space and time that the dots were linked together and made these trips. And when we did that for the 48 participants that gave us data for the entire month, we had over 21,000 trips, right? The way data mobility gave it to us were dichotomized these trips as static or en route. En route was a journey. A static trip was one of the examples that Anne showed, where you're moving about in a node, essentially, right? So we had this information that we could then look at some of the core concepts in crime pattern theory related to nodes, activity space, awareness space, right? And we even were given information, like Dan illustrated, on the modes of these trips. And so, for example, when I first got the data and opened it up, and I saw all these dots along the river, I thought, oh, we've got a problem. But then I thought, no.
There's a fish.
Right. Somebody swam the river. No, I realized, wow, this is really cool. We've got it. And so I sent them this picture. I said, guys, look, it shows them on ferries. Isn't that cool? Fishing waypoints. So yeah, we then began to take a closer look at these data. So here, for example, are the triads for a single participant, right, in the same general area of Brisbane. And so what we had to do was, of course, join all of the trips as unique line segments, right? So we had to take all the dots for every person, put them together to create lines that represented a single journey, right? And in this image here, what you have are the green dots, which are the 1 second interval time capture triads, and then the red dots showing the static trips, or the nodes where they moved around. And they're actually different size red dots. What I did there was showed how the proportion of time spent throughout the study period was allocated at the different nodes. So we could see the relative time spent at the different nodes, right? So that gives you an idea of what we were trying to pull out of the data just for one participant. So here is the same participant without the background color, where the dots have all been joined, right, to show the trip lines. So these are what we were talking about in terms of the pathways between nodes in a crime pattern theory context. Right? We were also able to look at the overlay of trips. So this just shows you the pathways, but some of the pathways were pathways taken more than once. Obviously, if you think about your own travel patterns, you tend to take the same way into work or school as you do every day. And so what we were able to do with some spatial analysis techniques looking at the density of lines is to develop this visual related to the relative frequency along those particular pathways. And then overlay nodes to look at where we're going and where we're spending our time, or where the participants were going and where they're spending their time. All right, so what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about some of the general findings and then give you a couple of examples that we think are real interesting that we're looking at more closely. So again, we had 48 participants that let us track them for an entire month. I said we had 21,000 trips, but a subset of this are actual unique routes taken by the 48 over the 30 days, and we had over 3,500 unique pathways that we were looking at. And these trips, again, the unit of analysis for trips, started from over 1,000 different places, right? So really fine-grained, cool information. Something I'm going to talk to you about a little bit is this notion that really hasn't come up in the literature, but inferred, especially in routine activities, talking about the convergence in space and time, is this concept of shared pathways. what we found was when we looked at everybody's trip pathways, everybody's routes, in our sample, we found that 80% of those pathways were not unique pathways, that they were pathways that somebody else took, right? So really an interesting concept, particularly in light of what routine activity says about the convergence in space and time, like victims, etc. So here what I've done is pulled out 4 examples, and these 4 panels are reflective of 4 of our participants to show you some of the concepts that we're looking at a little more closely with the analysis that we're currently conducting. So starting with the top 2, the scale bars here are 20 kilometers, so you can see how they vary, but the top 2, looking just at activity space, right? We see a good bit of variability across our participants in terms of the distance they're traveling and the number of pathways they take to go between their activity nodes. And if you think about these images in light of the typical image that you see in the literature when crime pattern theory or geometry of crime is discussed, this puts a different light on the matter, I think, right? And what we're really seeing here is considerable variability. We've got 2 here that are fairly similar in terms of the dispersion across space, but obviously different in terms of the routine activities, right? Reflected in the number of different pathways taken. On the other hand, the bottom 2 here, you've got much broader spatial activity, right? But kind of similar in terms of the number of pathways taken. But what we've seen, just to throw some stats out there for the quant lovers in the audience, we saw that the distances that these participants traveled varied quite considerably, ranging from a total distance, so adding up the distance of every path taken, ranged from as small as about 269 kilometers to over 2,600 kilometers, with an average distance that our participants took over the 30 days of about 800 kilometers. So that's some of the things that we're looking at in terms of activity space. Again, this idea of shared pathways. What we did is we took all 48 participants, overlaid their individual activity space images, and pulled out those that were not overlaid by anyone else's. Right? I thought this was crazy when I first did it and had to go back and make sure I wasn't mistaken, but people tend to take the same routes. Now, we haven't looked at this in terms of time to see what the convergence really is, or what I think is going to be really interesting when we start to overlay crime locations over them to see how intersections look in the context of where crime happens. But just looking at this shared pathways, it's implied in routine activities theory when we talk about the convergence in space and time of offenders and victims. But here we're really starting to see it, so we can start to describe it a little bit better. And again, 80% of the pathways that these participants took during the month were not unique. Then finally, we're starting to look a little bit about awareness space. And again, in crime pattern theory, awareness space is often described as the activity space you're in plus whatever's individual range, right? So we can use some, but little is talked about in terms of how aware, right? So coming up here, I come up here not as often as I go to the Gold Coast campus. I'm much more familiar or aware my activity space going to and from that campus than this campus, right? So what we've begun to do is start to quantify how aware is aware, right? And we can do that through some interpolation methods using line density. And so what we've done here is this visual shows the same 4 participants. It's like a hotspot crime map, but think of it as levels of awareness. So we've got gradations where the red reflects most aware, the orange slightly less aware, green even less, and then the white area the least aware. So we can look at things like the proportion of activity spaces that are most aware to our participants. And we see, again, quite a bit of variability in awareness space. And what we find is there, for these 48 participants, a relatively small subset of their activity space that we define as most familiar, most aware. About a quarter of that activity space for all participants combined. So those are a few of the things that have our interest right now. And there are things that we've been able to glean thus far, even though we're just getting into it. First thing, Facebook works. I'm not on Facebook, but wow. In terms of a social science recruiting tool for social science research, we were, like Dan was saying, sitting there and in the evening going, oh, look, hey, did you see it? One more person signed up. Yeah, refresh, 2 more people just signed up. It was a little crazy, but very successful in that sense. And really what blew our mind was that, people were willing to say, sure, track. One thing I will add, in terms of the incentives, we offered both $30 and $60 gift cards. And one of the things I found most interesting about the incentivizing of these people willing to be tracked was that about a quarter to a third didn't even bother collecting their incentives. I was like, hey, thanks for doing it. Email me whether you want Kohl's, Target, Cake. Didn't hear from a third. It's like, wow, we can budget that into a mod. No, we can't. Right? So as far as a recruit, and the project, a key component of the project was feasibility. Would this even work? And so far, yes. So the pilot was a success. Other things that we're starting to realize that we're still working on is, based on this small sample, it seems like, we can speak to some of the core concepts within environmental criminology, and they seem to hold, right? What we saw in that illustration of what is believed to be going on, we're seeing in the data. We also see quite a bit of variability at the individual level, and we're starting to really look at that more closely. That's essentially where we're at today. In terms of what we've identified thus far as some of the strengths and weaknesses, the data is incredible in terms of the spatio-temporal granularity, but the contextual information still needs some work. For example, the first run of the data of activity nodes that I'm still looking at, the typical nodes were there: school, work, and then like the third or fourth one was hotel. Really? So I'm going online looking, and what it looks like is some of the reference data that the vendor's using. If there's a bus stop next to like a rental center, right? Somehow it's becoming a hotel, right? So there's some work to be done there, and that relates to the second point here. Working with a vendor, as some of you know, we had a project a few years ago where we were trying to develop a similar app for the school. The commercial vendors are just so quick to outpace the things we were trying to work on that we couldn't keep up. The trade-off is much of it's a black box. We don't really know how they're inferring this, but we have to have conversations with really how they're, for example, how long does it take for the phone to be moving before it starts recording again, in terms of being able to then establish whether that's the home of the object. There's little things that we just have to verify. But on the strength side, everybody's got phones. They've got sensors in them. Incredible opportunity for social scientists. The example that Dan put there at the bottom, not a big deal. If you wanted to look at the routine activities of young people in Tokyo, Johannesburg, New York, Brisbane, with Facebook, smartphones, it's no problem. It's really easy. It's incredible. What we're doing next, this again was a pilot project. It was a pilot project that we used to make a stronger argument in a discovery grant application that we submitted for this upcoming funding round. And we're thinking about it, or what we've proposed is doing something similar but in 2 locations, Amsterdam and Brisbane, with a larger group for a larger period of time. But looking at the similar ideas, but bringing in more of the exposure to risk, personal experiences with victimization, etc. Some of the directions we may want to be heading in the future, looking at the settings of risky situations, variations in time, and pushing out more robust surveys with respect to the ecological momentary assessment side of the project. Questions? Comments? Concerns? Criticism?
Sure.